Dr. Russell Hittinger presents The Common Good and Its Counterfeits at the 2017 Newman Institute.
Thanks very much indeed to John Free and for inviting me and for the entire staff, clerical and lay, here at this Newman Center. It's an amazing place. I mean, it's the best I've seen in the country. And I hope and pray that everyone's worthy of it, because this is a fantastic project here. My thanks also to my old friend and your shepherd, Bishop Jim Connolly. And for all of you to coming out, including the real students here in the front row. I have a handout that I'm going to refer to some of these quotations for your own reference. I'm not going to read all of them, but every now and then I'm going to say, that's in quotation 2 or something, if you have that handout. Now, usually if you hear someone use the 2 words, or the 3 words, the common good, you know they're Catholic. 9 times out of 10. I mean, Protestants and others will say the public interest, or they'll say, when you hear the common good, you have a pretty good bet they grew up Catholic or educated Catholic. A lot of my non-Catholic friends tease me and others for using the term all of the time. And of course, it is not just a Catholic concept. I mean, it goes back to the Greco-Roman philosophers and political theoreticians of the ancient world, in which case it meant something fairly simple. If a group of human beings are to create a community bigger than their families and their extended kinship relations, an order beyond their uncles is a good way of putting it, called a political society, everyone has to be assured that that political society does not exist merely for the strong, but it exists for everyone who joins it. That's what was originally meant by common good. Something that's indivisible. What's good for one is good for all in this society. Now, actually, the concept of the common good is fairly simple, and I'm going to return to its simple meaning more than once. But like many simple things, in fact, most simple things are hard to explain. Being, or what, I mean, the most important concepts, you feel as though you have your hand on them and you can see what's going on, and then they kind of slip away. So I'm going to put my hand on it and let it slip away a bit and put my hand on it again. And after 45 minutes, I hope I leave you better off than when you came. Modern Catholic social teaching, which really has emphasized the concept of the common good, really began in response to the French Revolution. The creed of man and citizen that was announced in 1789 in France, liberty, equality, and fraternity. And this revolution and this new creed deeply affected Catholic life everywhere. Not just in France, because this creed spread to every country in Europe and to all of the colonies of Europe, South America, anywhere the Europeans had planted colonies. This creed was there 20 years later. And it was a special problem with Catholics. Not liberty and equality. Catholics never objected to those 2 terms, interestingly enough, because we think of liberty and equality as the modern stuff. Now, Catholics from the beginning resisted the concept of fraternity. For example, Cardinal Chiaramonte, who was Bishop of Imola in the north of Italy at the time of the Revolution, he would later become Pope Pius VII, who was kidnapped by Napoleon and spent 4 years in solitary confinement. But back when he was a mere cardinal, he had his stationery changed, and the stationery said, "Liberty, equality, and peace in our Lord Jesus Christ." It was fraternity that was the nub. And why? Article 3 of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen from that revolution, Article 3 read, quote, "The principle of sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No social body, no individual can exert any authority that does not emanate expressly from it." It left no doubt about its meaning. That is, fraternity, human fraternity, resides essentially in a social contract that reflects the general will, and any other friendship or association can exist only by virtue of private contracts that are approved by the state. In other words, the French Revolution asserted a monopoly by the state over human fraternity. And at one fell swoop, the very rich and diversified social life that had been built up for more than a millennium in Europe, religious orders, guilds, dioceses, independent municipalities, sacramental marriage, was capsized. Let me just give you an example. That Catholic culture that had evolved over centuries in Europe was a culture of vows. It was not a culture of contracts. They made contracts, of course, but essentially of vows, and vows are the deepest aspects of fraternity. For example, in 1790, the first year of the Revolution issued decrees prohibiting monastic vows. Then they prohibited all solemn vows. Solemn vows were criminal offenses. Not merely civil, but criminal offenses. And in their place, the Revolution required a clerical oath to the civil contract. All clerics had to go in their pulpits and take an oath to the contract. The episcopacy, the order of bishops, became an elected office. Bishops were turned into civil servants, elected by the majority of the population in their districts, including atheists, Jews, Protestants, well, bad Catholics too. 1791, marriage was made only a civil contract. Celibacy for the secular clergy was relaxed. 1792, the first law of unilateral and no-fault divorce was put in place by the Revolution. No-fault divorce, unilateral and no-fault divorce meant then, as it does now, that one party may show up and initiate a petition for divorce without showing a fault, any fault. It's the first one in the history of Western society. Californians were not the first. The French were. Second, that very same year, thank you, the Revolution abolished the monarchy. So the abolition of marriage, according to the law of no-fault divorce, followed by the abolition of the monarchy, spelled the demise of the two great vows that laity took in Catholic culture of the Middle Ages. Spouse to one another, husband to wife and wife to husband, and king to the realm. The two great vows, both of which involved the transfer of rings. That's what Catholics meant by fraternity. Fraternity is a matter of vows. And so from the outset, Catholics across Europe were not very confused by this. They understood that fraternity was the fighting issue. It took a long time, however, for the magisterial church to develop a coherent philosophical response to these events. This response congealed gradually, first during the papacy of Leo XIII, became Pope in 1878, at the age of 68 years old, and went on to write 110 encyclicals. It's amazing. He had a lot of time on his hands because he was a prisoner in the Vatican. He also had a telegraph machine, which gave him some incentive to keep writing. And then Leo's former student, who became Pius XI and became Pope in 1922. These two popes really put in place a response to the issue of counterfeit fraternities. And the cornerstone of their program was an understanding of what they called the three necessary societies. That is, societies necessary for human flourishing. Just a brief summary of that. Aristotle said that human beings are coupling animals. Human beings are matrimonial animals. And he said human beings are by nature political animals. And what Leo and Pius did and said, yeah, and there's one more. Human beings are by supernature, ecclesial animals. If you want to understand what a human being is, you have to understand a human being in fraternity, under vows, dedicated to a common life with other human beings in three quite distinct ways. Marriage, and it's the institution that's spawned by marriage, which is family, the domestic society, political society, and ecclesial society. Now, of course, there are other kinds of societies too. But these other societies, including today, tend to be more transient, revisable, subject to the free designs of human ingenuity. And if these other kinds of associations were to wither and die, we'd have a real social problem. But if these necessary societies were to meet their demise, it would be a calamity. Now, what these three societies have in common is each has a common good. That is, its members, whether it's matrimonial or political or ecclesial, its members are required to pursue a common end. They have an end in common. But they also have in common a shared social form of reciprocal action. They don't just intend to achieve an end, like a hedge fund company. They intend to achieve it together. Most importantly, it's the common good that is loved. Doing it together is an object of common love. Now, here's the first simple principle. In the Catholic tradition, common good is principally a matter of love. Two or more people sharing in a common end and common action who love the union itself. Only secondarily, importantly, but secondarily, is the common good a matter of things. That is, things that we can distribute and allocate. The common good is chiefly, as the canonists would say in matrimonial cases, is a bond. It's a bond between people. Only secondarily is it an organization of things. For instance, if you think of a parish and you go to the 1983 Code of Canon Law, you'll see two different definitions of a parish. One definition of a parish is an universitas rerum. That is, an organization of things. A parish consists of the lawn and of the bank accounts and the doors and so forth. But more essentially, a parish is an universitas personarum, is a bond of parishioners. Both are true, but it's important to understand what is the primary definition of a parish. Listen, we can even make the same point with regard to our own country. I know it's becoming increasingly difficult to speak this way about our own country, but simply look at the preamble to the U.S. Constitution. Quote, we, it begins with the word we the people of the United States, and here comes their common end, in order to form a more perfect union. Second, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare. The first principle, we have this end, to achieve a more perfect union. And it's by doing that we can go on and do these other things. So, 3 quick points about common good in its simplest meaning. Unlike Facebook or other disposable platforms of social interaction, a society that has a common good will have a common life. The Greek term is koinonia. The Latin term is communia. Now, for sure, to have a common life in a marriage or family, a common life in a polity, a common life in the church, are different ways of having a common life. They're not all the same, but they have this much in common. To have a common life means that we dwell in such societies. See, we don't dwell in social movements or political parties. People want to, but you can't dwell in a political party. You can't dwell in a field hospital, even. We don't dwell in Starbucks. I know. You go into them and people are acting like they want to, but in reality, we don't dwell in Starbucks. Nor do we dwell in some amorphous concept of a culture. We dwell where there's a social union with reciprocal action for common ends. That's what we dwell in. Second, if the goal is a common end that we have to do together, this implies indivisibility. You know, that word was actually used in our Pledge of Allegiance. Indivisible. A common good is not a divisible thing. You can't have 30% of it. I mean, you may choose to leave your renounce your citizenship, become French. But listen, you can't take 30% of your citizenship with you. It is simply logically not a divisible thing. Try to leave a marriage and convince a court. Even the corrupt courts we have today are not stupid. You can't take away 45% of your marriage. Try to take away 10% of your membership in the body of Christ. Well, you see right away that to even think of it as divisible in that sense is to lose the very concept that you're after. You either have it all or you have none in a common good. You either participate in it or you don't have it at all. And the third thing these societies have in common is that they are subsidiary to one another, these 3 societies. The word subsidiary means something that furnishes assistance, support, help under normal conditions. Members who dwell in one of these societies dwell also in the others. So, the members of this family are also members of the French Republic, and they're also members of St. Rita's Parish. These 3 societies, under normal conditions, we may be entering conditions that are very abnormal today. They have common members. They overlap in their membership. And therefore, each of these societies needs one another. Each provides some sort of subsidium or assistance to the others. Families provide the first subsidium because they create new members of the church and of the polity. They need each other, but no one of them can replace the others. Sometimes this is called hierarchical complementarianism, where two or more social groups, although they are different, need one another and they have to cooperate. And they have to give assistance to one another. And therefore, before I move on to some counterfeits, we should be very careful with the definite article, the common good. In fact, whenever I hear someone saying the common good, I know they're Catholic too, because it's a common mistake. See, in Latin, there's not a definite article there, which makes the concept easier to track. It's just bonum commune. What has this property, bonum commune? You don't have to say the here, because it's very clear if you look at quote 2, which is from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, that begins, each human community possesses a common good, which permits it to be recognized as such. There's not just one. Now, I've mentioned 3 societies. There may be more. Each one of them has their own common good. The common good of a marriage is different than the common good of a polity, is different than the common good of the church. So we have to be very careful with the definite article. There is one good place to use it. I will speak of that later. So what's the problem? But the problem is that the word common can be used in so many different ways and mean actually things that are absolutely opposed to one another. So let me first mention a counterfeit notion of common good that is just purely wrong. It is not right at all. And it's the notion that members of a social union stand as parts to a whole in the same way as the parts of a living body inhere in an individual substance. I mean, my hand, without being substantially one with the rest of me, has no function whatsoever. Clearly, this is not how we operate in a social union. I'm sure that wives will tell their husbands that both spouses in a marriage have operations that are not just substantially one with a body. This position has sometimes been called substantialism, that two human beings are sort of joined, not just at the hip, into a common substance. We know this is erroneous. I mean, Genesis begins, actually, by telling us this is erroneous. If you go, remember there's 2 creation stories in Genesis. I'm going to kind of put them both together. God begins creating by creating energies. And then a threshold is crossed where God begins to create natural kinds. Let's say substances. Birds, plants, fish, kinds of things. And then there's another pause, and a threshold is crossed. Is let us make man in our image, male and female, he created them. But Genesis does not imply that man and woman became a new substance like a plant or a bird. Rather, man and woman realize a different thing than a substantial perfection. They realize the perfection of a community of persons. And this is why Augustine says in his commentary on Genesis, after every one of the previous days, God says, he saw that it was good. And it was only after the sixth, very good, because the unity of two persons in a community of persons is the perfection of the hexameron, the days of creation. You know, Adam is lonely in Genesis 2. He can't resolve himself, this is John Paul II's interpretation, he can't resolve himself either into God or into the beasts. And so God puts Adam into the deep sleep and produces Eve. It's not a shotgun marriage. We know it's not a shotgun marriage because Adam gives his consent in a beautiful canticle. At last bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, and for this reason a man shall leave his house. It's not a substantial union, it's matrimony. If it were a substantial union, either Adam or Eve, or both of them, would have to be destroyed, just the way you destroy your food when it becomes part of you. Only the divine Trinity exists as a unity of persons in a single substance. And it's a mystery. It's utterly sui generis. The three persons of the divine Trinity are distinct persons in substantial relations to one another. It's a mystery. Human beings, however, are not the divine Trinity. If we were to have substantial relations to one another, we turn into each other. Someone would have to die. And in any case, this is a counterfeit position, which I've just briefly described because I don't think it's worth spending much more time on. No serious Catholic thinker or authority has ever proposed that human beings become the same substance when they enter into community with one another, much less that even in heaven that we become the divine Trinity. This is not our problem. This counterfeit position today is not our problem. Among other reasons, because people today don't even think about substantial unities, so they're not very tempted by them. Our problems today with the notion of a common good have to do with the fact that we are a global commercial market society in which we tend to think of commonalities chiefly in terms of either external goods that are not personal at all, or we think of individuals simply as interacting with one another. That's the opposite of a common substance. This is where we're just an aggregate of persons who socially interact, but constitute no common good. And this is the principle followed by most of the social sciences today. It's called methodological individualism. That is, methodologically we assume that social unities and relations among members can be reduced to non-social properties of the members or composites thereof. So for us, what's really easy to imagine is mere interactionism combined with a bit of intersubjectivity, but without ever intending to constitute a social subject, that is, a common good. And here, maybe you'd permit me to look at quote 3. It's one of John Paul II's most interesting references to a common good as a social subject, something greater than merely intersubjectivity. And this is on his letter to families, 1994, where he says, "But the rights of the family are not simply the sum total of the rights of the person, since the family is much more than the sum of its individual members. It is a community of parents and children, and at times a community of several generations. And for this reason, its status as a subject, which is grounded in God's plan, gives rise to and calls for certain proper and specific rights. In the first place, the family achieves the good of being together. This is the good par excellence of marriage, and hence its indissolubility, and of the family community. It could also be defined as a good of the subject as such, Just as the individual person is a subject, so too is the family, since it's made up of persons who, joined together by a profound bond of communion, form a single communal subject. Not a single substance, a single communal subject. And what is a subject? It's the locus of rights and responsibilities. There are such things as communal subjects, and the family is one. Well, so is the marriage. When man and woman become married, they hold themselves out to the rest of society as a social subject that needs to be recognized as such. It won't do to treat either of us merely as an individual. Henceforth, you do an injustice to us if you were to do that. But as I say, in our culture today, you can take a look at quote 4. It's from my colleague in the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, Stefano Zamagni, who points out, we think of the social commons today merely of external interactions between human beings, not as social subjects. And therefore, this can't help but drastically change our understanding of what a common good is. So, now I'm going to go through 3 counterfeits that aren't absolutely wrong, but wrong enough so they shouldn't count as a primary definition of the common good. The first I call concurrence of wills. Let's take a number of people gathered in a shopping mall, or a piazza, or a theater. I guarantee you there's plenty of intersubjectivity going on. I mean, even in a mob, people are aware of other people being aware of them. Moreover, even in a mob, people are capable of communications. That is, by words, songs, plethora of meaningful gestures. Indeed, just to take the shopping mall, we adjust our actions to the flow of the aggregate all the time. Every time you walk through the mall or pull onto the highway in your car, you are adjusting as one bit of a very large aggregate of other human beings. There's plenty of intersubjectivity. I'm already angry with the other driver. But none of us pretend that we have just entered a society. Or take, for example, the chain gang, if such things exist anymore. The dynamism of a chain gang is undeniably social. It evinces a common set of constraints and communicative opportunities, but we'd be rather dubious that a chain gang is a society. Intersubjective like all get out. So, according to our modern understanding, markets are social in this sense. We like to think of common goods as markets. It could mean a place of sorts where one goes to shop and make exchanges. That is, it's a common place where we get this business done. But no one would confuse a Home Depot membership card with a social membership, right? This is the skyboxification of America, in which you have a special status, membership status for boarding airplanes or selecting seats or being at the very best seat at the football game. No one would confuse that with a social membership. In fact, it means the opposite, does it not? A membership card means you get to skip the social part of it. It's merely a private good with social implications. Okay. But here's a market in the more modern sense of the term. It's not even a place. It's simply a very complex set of signs. It's semiotical. Signs about what? Prices. Signs about prices. By the way, if they're signs, they're social. There's no such thing as signs that aren't social. So we admit that a market is very social, but yet it's not a society at all. Let me read a quotation from an early 20th century Jesuit named Heinrich Pesch. I don't have this on your sheet of quotations, but it's short. Quote, "The fact that everyone has the same urge to make a profit and that they all operate in accord with the same natural conditioning factors and do basically the same thing represents a kind of concurrence in what they do. But it does not add up to a communal activity. In fact, no community actually emerges in a market." It's true. A market's not a society. It's very social, but there's no society. Ideally, a market is good for everyone who enters it, if it's not distorted or corrupted. And you can say a market is common in that way, but it is not a social common good. There's no sharing of lives in it. So, let me move into something I think is a little closer to a notion of common good than just crowds, intersubjective crowds or markets. I'd call them partnerships. I'll give a very concrete example. Two or more persons agree to pool their resources for a common end. I can think of my own teacher's retirement fund, right? Every month, put in X amount of money, and it's a common pool of investments. Each one of us contributes such and such amount of money over time into a common fund. In some important sense, what is good for one is good for the other. That is, every one of us have a common interest in the growth of that pool of investment. And let's also stipulate that we have common rules governing the management costs as well as rules governing how investments can be withdrawn. But this entire network of common things, a common pool and common rules, is for the sake of private yield, truly private yield, not just individual, and rightly so, for our end in an investment partnership is the ability to withdraw from the common pool what is our share at the end of the game. In fact, the association, an investment association, is fulfilled when each one receives his private due. In fact, it's fulfilled when we get out of it. That's what makes it not like a social common good. The union actually is in the things pooled together. Every one of us is entitled to cash out. In fact, we can dissolve the partnership altogether. Under certain rules, we can do that. This has some aspect of common good. A common pool with common rules, but it's not a social common good. Strictly speaking, it's not a social common good. I can cash out anytime I want. In fact, it doesn't really require us to even cooperate together very much. I mean, we don't even have to be in the same place. This can be done fairly anonymously. In fact, it is done fairly anonymously for any of you who go online to check your own investments. You will see that logarithms govern most of this. It simply has no koinonia or communio to it. It's not bad, it's just not strictly a social common good. Let me give an example. Not only does it lack koinonia, but it lacks indivisibility. Of course, it can be divided. It's supposed to be divided. I can take 10% or 80%. So can you. Let's say, example, the guy comes into a bar and says, congratulate me. Well, everyone's already prepared to hoist a drink anyway, but they say, for what? And he says, this is the 25th year of my lease for a Honda Accord with Honda Motors. You say, you idiot, right? You're an idiot. You don't know what the meaning of a lease is. Are you sending Christmas cards to Honda Motors, exchanging pictures of the kids? No, you're an idiot. You're supposed to do this for 2 or 3 years and cash out, right? Because, oh God, I really was stupid. I thought it was a community. Okay. And he comes back the next Friday. Congratulate me. I said, well, of course we will, but what is it this time? It's my 25th wedding anniversary. Everyone goes, here, here. Everyone. I don't care what position they have politically on marriage. Here, here. It's recognized right away that it's implicit in the notion of that kind of social union. It's really good if it lasts for a long time. And here, here. Good job. It's not like your lease. I mean, it's like your lease now for a lot of Americans, perhaps. But we all know it would be a category confusion if we were to test it out. So, finally, there's something wrong with calling that common good. Mere partnerships is what I'm saying. Finally, one that comes really close to the authentic notion of a common good, but it's near beer. It's not quite there yet. And that's what I call teams. So this is a social formation that comes really close to what we've traditionally defined as bonum commune, where 2 or more persons intend a common end that transcends private yield, and who intend common action that perfects its members. Indeed, teams can be organized for a common end, sometimes with an internal solidarity that's enjoyed for its own sake. I'm thinking not only of special military units like Navy SEALs. They have a common end, and it's not private yield, and they're highly organized. I mean, actually, they become best friends of sorts to be able to pull this off. But let's use the example of an orchestra, a little less militaristic. An orchestra not only intends to produce the Haydn Symphony, but intends to do it together. Just as the crew team does not just want to win the race, it wants to do it as a crew team. In fact, doing it together is one of the reasons of action, that you're doing it at all. And in these kind of cases, members of teams seem to love the union in common action, and they love it enough that they keep doing it even if they don't achieve their end. If you're a Cubs fan, you know all about this. Okay. The crew team doesn't win the race. Is it still a crew team? You bet. Because the common good is not just the external end, it's the koinonia, the doing of it together. And for good reason, some social scientists today call teams a kind of social capital. You may be familiar with Putnam's book about bowling teams. When bowling teams declined in the Great Lakes region, all kinds of other social activities declined with it, because we kind of learn how to be a member of a common good through teamwork. Even so, highly specialized teams really don't have a common life. United States Marine Corps notwithstanding, we don't live in teams. In fact, their work is over when the game or the mission ends. And what's just as important, how we're perfected as a member of a team, like an orchestra or the Navy SEALs or crew team, doesn't reach all the way down with regard to perfecting our social loves. but they're close, and they should be respected. Like, who has not secretly or openly wished that their spousal or familial or political or ecclesiastical memberships could have the joy of a team? Teams are important. They get us really close. They teach people how to say ours, but they lack several important aspects of bonum commune. So, I return to the simple notion of it. And I use matrimony as exemplary. And we should take matrimony to be exemplary. Aristotle does, actually, in Book 2 of the Politics. It's the first community. We are coupling animals. Jesus took it seriously. It's the first sacrament in New Covenant. The first one instituted, anyway. And for the church, it's extremely important because it's the only one of the 7 sacraments that has as its natural sign a social koinonia. It's the natural sign of the sacrament of matrimony. What's Eucharist is bread and wine. But matrimony is matrimony. It has that kind of profundity to it. And is it not true that spouses do not just wish to reproduce? They wish to procreate matrimonially. And is there not some difference? In fact, of course there's a difference. By today, we all know what the difference is. Not as though Phoenician sailors didn't know too. But a married couple want to do it together, matrimonially. Reproduction can be done outside of matrimony as a biological fact. But that's not what is intended by spouses. It shouldn't be. And spouses can say this about their children. Children are ours. They're ours. Any married people who have a family know. They may violate this now and then, but they know that the husband does not go to the child and say, "Daddy loves you so much, this is Daddy's medicine for you." It would destroy familial relations. You're not just getting gifts from Daddy. It's the marriage itself is some kind of communal subject that's taking care of the kids. Daddy doesn't own the kid. Mommy doesn't own the kid. In fact, even in our demented courts today, they really know that you can't divide the kids. Not literally. And as I said, even in our demented courts today, the judge knows that he can divide, or he or she can divide the property in a divorce case. Like the husband gets the channel changer or something like this. The wife gets the drapes or the table. You can't divide the marriage. Someone cannot say, "I want at least 45% of this." It's a true common good. You can destroy it, all right, but you can't divide it. There's no other way to have it but being a member. And such is true also in church and in polity. There's no way to be a good citizen other than being a good citizen. There is no other way to have it. It's indivisible. All of the traditionally understood necessary societies are indivisible, and they're meant to last forever. Well, not eternally necessarily, the church will, but it's proper that they continue that bond of friendship until the end. And what we owe to each other is those virtues and actions, like vows, in which we pledge ourselves to love what is ours and not to take what really is ours as a merely private good and a private possession. Now, the justice that both Aristotle and Aquinas apply to being just as a good member is to love what is ours. It's actually a kind of love that is required by justice. And I want to give an example here from quote 7. From Dante. And I'm going to end more or less with this, with a few words about this. Dante was a very serious reader of Aristotle and of Thomas Aquinas. Now, they say he was buried in a Franciscan habit. May or may not be true, but his mind was very Dominican, at least on some of these subjects. And of course, the beginning of the Divine Comedy is Dante is the pilgrim being led through the Inferno. And by the way, who are in the very pit of hell? By the way, which is not a fire. It's ice cold. Who are in the very pit of hell? Traitors. The traitors are in the pit. The worst of all sins is the traitor who, for his own private good, turns upon the commonality. Judas and Brutus, I think, are in there. I can't remember them all. John would. And then he is led, with Virgil as his interpreter and guide, into purgatory. And in Canto 14 of Purgatory, Dante and Virgil meet up with the ghost of this guy who was a real character named Guido del Duca, right out of Essex County, Jersey. Guido del Duca, who was a very tough politician from that center part of Italy, around where the Papal States were. And this ghost says how much he laments all of the fratricidal politics of his city. Basically, he was kind of like a Tony Soprano who really does feel sorry about this now. And he means by fratricidal politics, not just tough competition, right? It's making people swim with the fishes in the Arno River, kind of thing. And Guido del Duca attributes this sin and this vice to Cain, who murders his brother Abel out of envy. And so in the very next canto, which is Canto 15, Dante turns to Virgil and asks for an explanation. And here I read, I thought I'd gather profit from his words, and even as I turned toward him, I asked, what did that spirit of Romagna mean when he said, sharing cannot have a part? And his reply, that's Virgil, he knows the harm that lies in his worst vice. For when your longings center on things such that sharing them apportions less to each, then envy stirs the bellows of your sighs. But if the love within the highest sphere should turn your longings heavenward, the fear inhabiting your breast would disappear. For there, the more there are who could say, ours, so much the greater is the good possessed by each. So much more love burns in that cloister. So I take Virgil's teaching to be something like this. In strict justice, things that are divisible ought to be divided justly. It's common sense. Divisible things should be divided justly. And the lust that belongs to what someone else has gives rise to envy. So We can't be right with our neighbor. We can't love our neighbor if we take or wish to destroy what is his. Everyone should have what is his own, which is the old formula of justice, to give to each what is their due, to have their own. Divisible things should be justly distributed. But what Guido del Duca is saying, that's not why he's in purgatory. Guido del Duca is saying he's in purgatory not because he goofed the divisibles, but because he didn't love the indivisible. He's in purgatory until he figures out how to say ours. And by the way, he can't go to paradise yet, because paradise can't be loved merely as a divisible. It can only be loved in terms of what is ours. So when we do get to the Paradiso with Dante, by the way, his guide is now Bernard of Clairvaux at the very end. We see that the saints are grouped in paradise in two ways. First, they're graded hierarchically according to what is their due. Everyone is filled to as much as they can receive of the divine good, but some people have more in them. And it's based upon their merits. Based upon merits. Because in divisible things, everyone should have what is their due. But when you get to the end of the Paradiso, Bernard of Clairvaux introduces him to the celestial rose, in which the saints are grouped, not like in condos, up and down. They're dancing in a circle, in which it's clear that the celestial rose isn't indivisible. You can only have it by participating in it together. And it's called a comedy, because in comedy, everyone gets more than what they deserve. And what is the comedy? The ultimate comedy is the God-man. It's comical in a metaphysical sense that man gets more than what he deserved. He gets the God-man and is able, therefore, to participate in a divine common good through Christ. That is truly a Catholic understanding of bonum commune. Bonum commune is only secondarily things. With regard to things, yes, they should be distributed justly. And yes, there are some kinds of things that affect all of us, unless you're Peter Thiel and can live in New Zealand or something. But by and large, it affects all of us. Water, clean air, a good public transportation system. I go for having a good system of traffic lights. I wouldn't want to live without a good system of traffic lights, although I live in a state that has no use for them. But there are some things that affect all of us. Some adequate income, adequate attention through health care. We can call that working for the common good in the sense we're working for things that everyone needs, but these are divisible things. It's like a water system. We agree to pool the water in the municipal water system. But at the end of the day, it comes out of my tap and I'm drinking it. The water is for me. If the water system's working right, it's for me. Flush the toilet. And by the way, we usually don't have parties around flushing toilets. It's a private thing. Okay. The common good is primarily the social union in which we share in each other's lives in an indivisible way. It's primarily actions, not things. That's why teams are important. They show you're a good team member if you perform the right actions. It's not who has the glove or the bat or this kind of thing. It's the actions. I could say more, but I'm going to end on this because I've reached my time. I think most of us can see why marriage, I'm sure in this room, is truly bonum commune. Two people joined in a common life, common end, and shared way of pursuing it. When you give, as Aquinas said, when you give your consent to marriage, you're not just giving your consent to Mary or Alice, you're giving your consent to union with Mary or Alice. And Mary Alice is giving her consent to union with you. It's a consent to the union. That's why when you go in here, people take vows today outside of the church. They prattle on forever about how much they like the other person and all these things. They never promise to be in union with them. And it makes quite a difference. But I think all of us here can understand how matrimony is a common good and family. I'm assuming we can see how church is a common good. We are baptized into a social bond, the body of Christ, and capacitated to communicate in friendship with the divine Trinity through the second person. We all understand that the church, the internal union of the church, is the unitas affectus, affection of the Holy Ghost. Okay, we understand the church is not just a divisible thing. It's not a gas station. The one probably that is most difficult for us today is the polity, what we call the state, because it looks like it's nothing more than a delivery device for distributable goods. Maybe that's not true in Nebraska, as much as it will be in much of the world today, but state does not look like a koinonia. It looks like, at best, a municipal water system that's delivering or redistributing stuff to be used for private purposes. I don't think this is a good development at all, because I don't believe we can live on this earth properly in a matrimonial or an ecclesial sense without having sound political relationships. There's no good that's going to come from polity just being turned into a delivery device of divisible goods. First of all, we argue about them all the time, and we end up like Guido del Duca. We just want to kill each other over the thing. This is a bad development. And I'd have more to say about it, except I've already tested your patience long enough, and it's 8:20 in the evening, so I should stop. Time for a few questions?
Sure.